It doesn't matter if you're a beginner or if you've been sewing for a long time, there are certain things you need to take into account when you start a new project. Did I change the needle? No. Did I cut on the grain? No, I did not. What a mess. So let's make a list of basic things you should take into account when you step in the sewing room or wherever you sew. And if you have more, leave them in the comments down below because it's really interesting to have a look. And if you like this kind of content, consider subscribing. And I leave you here my Instagram account as well if you want any other content. The problem is that the beginner doesn't know all these steps, and the person who knows already knows and skips steps, so don't skip. Washing and ironing your fabric is basic. I have garments that keep shrinking wash after wash, so I prefer to just be safe and wash my piece of fabric before cutting it. It doesn't take me that long and it's not hard work. I just put it in the machine. Some people believe it's not necessary because they say fabrics come with a treatment that avoids all this shrinking. But I've had bad experiences, so I prefer being safe and wash it. And ironing, this is so important. Not only pressing your seam, but ironing before cutting. It makes no sense to cut a fabric that is all wrinkly from the washing. It's much better to cut it when it's nice and flat. When you buy your fabric, the meters you're getting is the grain of your fabric. It doesn't stretch at all. Then you have horizontally the cross grain, which it does stretch a little bit, and then the bias, a diagonal cut that has a lot of flow and stretches a lot more. So you should cut on the grain, although sometimes once you know your rules, you can cut cross grain. For example, if you have stripes and you want your sleeves or a ruffle to have another pattern, a different pattern, so you cut cross grain, that's fine. And then of course the bias, you cut on the bias when you want something a lot more flowy, like a skirt or another kind of ruffle, something like that. That's just fine, but what you cannot do is to cut your pattern different ways just to make the most out of your fabric. This happens to beginners, and you buy your meter of fabric and you think you can place your pattern different ways to make your garment, and it's fine. It's not. You have to take into account that when you sew, you're going to not waste, but when you cut fabric, you have lots of different pieces you can use for patchwork or to fill in cushions, lots of ideas, but you're going to waste fabric. But if you cut your pattern different ways, a sleeve on the bias, another sleeve cross grain, and the body is the same, it won't fit properly. It will twist, it will turn, and you'll feel really uncomfortable, and you'll end up not wearing it. So cut properly. Seam allowance, this is so important. I'm sure it's happened to all of us, and it is that when we're cutting, we cut just at the edge of our pattern, and then we won't have enough fabric. By doing this, your garment will shrink like 4 centimeters because it's what you need to sew. So just make sure you leave it, make sure the pattern you're using has or hasn't got seam allowance, so you can add it or take it into account when you cut it. But this is really important. It's happened to all of us, I'm sure, but you can avoid it. Avoid headaches. Headaches are the worst. And apart from the seam allowance, we have to take into account the ease. And what is this? This is what you need to be comfortable in your clothes. Take into account that when you bend an elbow or a knee, or when you sit down, your clothes need to be a bit flowier, so it allows you that movement. When you're using pattern magazines, they've already thought of this, so you don't have to worry. You do if you're cutting your own patterns and you're designing your own clothes. You need a bit of ease, especially if your fabrics are not stretchy, because they have more structure. And if you have even heavier fabrics, you'll need more centimeters, maybe even 2 centimeters ease. So depending on your fabric, you'll need 1 or even 2 centimeter ease if it's a thicker or heavier fabric, so just make sure you do it. And of course, using the right tools. I always say that tools are not a waste of money, but an investment. They make your life much easier and whatever you're working on, much nicer. We're talking using the right foot for what you're sewing, and of course the right needle. This is so important, because if not, you won't be able to sew it. If your needle is not the right one for a thin fabric or for a thicker one, you won't be able to sew it and you'll probably break it. So make your life easier and your sewing nicer and use the proper tools. And before we start sewing our project, we're going to taste our fabric. We're going to see how the color thread we chose looks. We're going to see how the tension works with this fabric or the needle. This is really important, and you can use the fabric you thought you were wasting in something useful. So have a test. And when you finally sit in front of your sewing machine, remember to use your reverse lever. It's ideal because you're making sure that your seam is not going anywhere. If you don't use it, it will open later on, and you don't want that. Take into account that when you sew by hand, you always do a knot at the beginning and at the end, so your seam doesn't come apart. So this is the same. This is your knot making in the machine. And one thing we cannot miss is the cleaning and oiling of the machine. The thread creates lint and lint gets stuck. You have to get rid of it so the machine can sew properly, and you'll notice the difference when you've done it. It only takes 10 minutes, it's not that long at all, and you'll really realize how useful it is and how good it is to have it nice and clean. If not, it won't sew properly, and you can even break needles if it's getting stuck, so just take care of it. And one thing we always forget about is our own comfort. Things like the right clothing to wear while sewing, being comfortable in your clothing. Things like the chair you're using. Choose an ergonomic chair. Some people have asked me if my chair is comfortable enough, but I haven't got any problems with it. It's true that I don't spend like 8 hours sewing straight away, but I am comfortable. And of course, things like tools. Having tools by hand in both places, on the cutting table and on the sewing machine, it's really comfortable because you have pins when you need them, you have scissors when you need them, and things like that. Having double the tools, it's really good. And one thing we never talk about enough is being safe. We're handling tools, sharp objects, and of course the machine, it's really strong. It's a powerful machine and you can get stuck in there. So just be careful where you put your fingers. Just be careful when you use scissors that are really sharp to cut your fabric. Be careful when you use tools like pins. When I started sewing, I used to be so afraid of losing pins and stabbing myself with a pin that I used to count them. I put so many pins in and I take so many out to make sure I never lost anyone. So just be careful with your fingers and with everything you do so you don't have any accidents. And another thing to take into account is your fatigue. If you're tired, as well as fatigue, when you're tired, you're prone to accidents because you're not focused. So just make sure you're not tired when you're sewing because you're handling tools and powerful machines. So just be safe. It's true that we've talked about many of these things many times, but it's also true that many of you might be thinking, oh, I haven't cleaned my sewing machine for a long time, or oh, I didn't know this. So it's always good to refresh and have a look as well on what we're doing. So if you like this kind of content, consider subscribing if you're new around here. I would really appreciate it. It helps the channel a lot, and that way you don't miss anything, because I upload twice a week. And I leave you here all the talking about sewing videos, which are always good to have a look at. Bye!
Uy, madre mía, bien hablo, por favor.